2024 has been one hell of a year, so let's talk about it. It is pretty crazy that we are currently sat in the last few hours of 2024, which has been quite a year in women's football. It really does feel like we're just wrapping up 2023 and a historic World Cup, looking into 2024, and now all of a sudden we're wrapping up a 2024 that had plenty take place as we look forward to what hopefully is going to be a historic 2025 with an exciting Euros in Switzerland. It's been a very busy year in both the international stage and club football. We have seen some historic figures take place in terms of broadcast deals, viewership numbers, attendance, average records, just the overall attention and the growth of the game. We continue to see exponential growth of women's sports, not just women's soccer, women's football, whatever it is you want to call it, guys. We still get a crisis about this word. Today, I'm going to be attempting to recap as much as possible of what has happened this year. It does feel, though, that I could probably be sat here for another 2 to 3 hours to talk about it, because there's been so many exciting things that has happened, and it's almost really hard to think about what has happened from January up until today, because as you may know, it's never a dull day in women's football. And so it's like, how do you capture 65 days of just so much happening every day, all day? It does feel as though that every single year has had an international competition, and this year was no different. It was marked by the 2024 Paris Olympics in the summer. And just like every Olympics cycle that we go into, specifically for the last 2 or 3 editions, I would say, there's been some very valid questions and concerns about the schedule, the congestion, the turnaround dates, which, I mean, there's really no turnaround dates. It's one game after the other. You may be lucky to get a day of rest and a day of training before you have another game. And it is quite chaotic. We saw how injuries hit the Brazilian team. We saw how injuries throughout the competition was hitting different teams. The use of alternates and calling up alternates it's just a weird kind of attempt to want to say you are prioritizing player well-being when that's not really the case. It's like there's a lot of loopholes, but it could be made a little bit better if, one, a squad is a little bit bigger than 18 players, and 2, the turnaround days aren't as ridiculous as they are. And so off the field, there was a lot of conversations to be had about what this Olympics mean, what does it impact women's football, and how should it drive it to move forward. So let's talk a little bit about the on-field stuff. We saw the U.S. men's national team reclaim some of their dominance that they had lost in the past 2 to 3 years. We've seen the team go through an era change. We're seeing kind of the big old dogs retire, the Megan Rapinos, the Alex Morgan, Carly Lloyd, if you want to get back a few years. Sam Ewis, that kind of sour burn, like that bunch of just dogs, Carly Lloyd removed, they're all retiring. And so we're seeing a different era of the team. And on top of that, it's not just a shift in the players that are in the squad, but we saw Emma Hayes come in and show her dominance once again when it comes to her pedigree of coaching. What she's done at Chelsea can never be undermined. And I'm not sure if it'll ever be replicated in this day and age. And she came into the U.S. men's national team with huge pressure on her. There was a huge task of to turn around the result after what was a catastrophic World Cup according to the U.S. national team standards. And, was it the most convincing run at the Olympics? Probably not. But at the Olympics, it doesn't have to be the most convincing run. At the Olympics, it's a matter of who's going to be the most fit when it comes to the final. How are you going to handle extra time and going into 120 minutes and going into penalties? And who has it in them to just be able to just get that fine, it's small margins, and the U.S. men's national team was able to do that. And they had to do it against Brazil, who in their own right had a brilliant campaign. They were hit with so many injuries. They too have a new young head coach. We saw Marta and that red card drama, the way they beat the Spaniards. It was a really exciting Brazil team that was... I want to say it was a mix of veterans and youngsters, but that wasn't so much the case when injuries were coming into the squad. But I think there's a really exciting thing about this Brazilian team, the way they just play exciting attacking football. The Olympics, I think, was, for me, personally really fun to watch how Brazil played and how they just dealt with so much adversity. So the US got to reclaim their throne almost, and it's like, okay, we're back on the big stage and we're here to scare a few opponents. Understandably, it's not going to be as easy as it was maybe 10 years ago. Like, I think everybody's understood that. There's no conversation about it, but it's exciting to see how Emma Hayes continues to build for the Americans. There's no competition next year, and so for them, it's going to be building on that momentum, building on some of the mistakes, fixing some of those mistakes, perhaps I should say, and prepping for the 2027 Women's World Cup. And so it was exciting to see Brazil and US hit it at the top, and Spain got knocked out in quite some fashion. And I think, it's weird. I don't know how to assess Spain's year because, should their head coach be in the position that she is? No, I don't think so. I think we're still seeing some of that drama, and I think it's still frustrating to see how messed up of a federation they're having to deal with. And it was like Spain didn't really improve or go backwards in such a year. I think we saw some drainage and fatigue at the Olympics from them, which was to be expected, to be quite honest. But I don't know if the Spaniards look back and say, yeah, we've had a really successful year, we're moving forward. But they also probably don't say, we've gone backwards. They've almost plateaued this year, which for the world champions, how much is that plateau going to help you going into a Euros year? And it's, their draw is not the easiest. It's going to be interesting to see how Spain handles it. But for me, it's still a rotten background that's working with them. You have to change the head coach. You have to change. It just needs a cleanup. And talking of house cleanups, Canada had one of the most eye-grabbing scandals we have seen in women's sports, and it just had to come at the Olympics. I covered the Canadian scandal and the whole investigation of the drone quite extensively on this channel, so if you're interested, absolutely feel free to go back a few episodes, certainly back to the summer, and see how that unfolded. But that was also a team that has been consistently failed by their federation. You might wonder, well, Miriam, what do you mean? It was a coach that was spying, and there was a coach that just decided to throw up a drone. What we came to realize is that it was much, much, much deeper than that. This is a sort of behavior that has been allowed for almost half a decade. This is the sort of behavior that was allowed. It was accepted in the culture. We come to understand that there was a very toxic coaching culture in the team, and it was all allowed. The federation earlier this year had conducted a third-party investigation, and that investigation came back with a few alarms, but the federation didn't really care too much. They put it on the back shelf, and they renewed Beth Priestman's contract, which is very wild to think, knowing what we know now about some of the findings of that investigation. And so, was it nice to see the Canadian team go through what they did? No, but I think it was quite necessary and important for that, a hell of a, I don't even know what you call it, a volcano. Like, it was just an earthquake that hit the federation and the team. That, for me, was like the wake-up call that was needed to finally clean up a house of Canada soccer, which is riddled with corruption and riddled with just deception, and it is just not a very pretty place. And so, I wish it was a simpler phone call and a wake-up call than this big of a scandal to clean up the house? Absolutely. But there's certain things in women's football, I think, where And I really am not surprised, because once again, I say there are certain things in women's football that go on ignored for so long. They're given the blind eye for so long that we're seeing now moments where an eruption happens. Canada Soccer had it this year. The Spanish Federation had it last year at the World Cup. Like, it's not out of nowhere that we see huge scandals in women's football. There's a reason for that, and it's because these players continue to be ignored when they do talk about it. And so I expect another big scandal to come out next year. Who will it be? That's the major question. But unfortunately, that's part of how women's football is going to grow, is we're going to see these big, major, ugly truths come out because of how women's football has been treated, how it's been ignored, and how it's constantly kind of put on like the back burner of we'll get to that later. And now it's like you can't get to it later. The bottle is exploding. And so Canada was the victim this year. Other than that, it was a really exciting Olympics. I think how they fought back was also quite a nice story. When we take a step back and look at how the other internationals have done, Wales, huge year. I did a video earlier on Ireland, Scotland, and touched on Wales a little bit. What a year they've had. They qualify for their first ever Euros. I think that's major for a country that's really tried to push in the past 20 to 24 months. But similarly, there's other teams that take a back step, just like Ireland and Scotland, who, again, I did a major video on those as well. France had another disappointing year. They're stuck in a limbo, and I did another video as well on France of why they've just continued to disappoint year on year. They have some of the most talented players we see on the European stage. They're exciting. They usually come up as the Golden Boot winners. You look at Diani, you look at Katoto, and that's a Katoto that's coming back from an ACL injury. What is it that's happening in the team? And so I'd recommend you listen and watch that video if you're interested a little bit to know a little bit more about that French team and why they've struggled the way they have for the past 7 or 8 years on major competitions. And so for them, they were probably hoping to do really good at home at the Olympics, but once again they fall short in a very disappointing manner. It's just all very underwhelming with what happens with that French team. Denmark and Germany are some of the teams that I'm very happy to see take forward steps. Even Norway, I would say, they had some struggles when it came to the World Cup and some of the smaller friendlies, but we've seen some changes in that. It's all exciting when I look at these European teams heading into the World and to the Euros. I don't think Germany was given enough praise at the Olympics. I don't think many people rated them to do what they did and end up on the podium and have a medal. But I think the way that some of their young exciting talent showed up. Laura Freigang, I have to give a shout out. Leah Schuler for me as well. And not to mention, the German team lost Lena Oberdorf days before the competition started. So we need to be giving up to the Germans, and I think I'm still looking forward to see how they continue to develop and to continue answering some very big questions heading into the Euros. And so we also saw England take some back steps or perhaps be tested and be in trouble. They too are the defending champions going into the Euros. How do they handle that and how do they solve that? And so when it comes to the international stage, I think it has been an exciting year. The Olympics, there's always a feel of the Olympics that it's not as major of a competition as the World Cup or as the Euros or perhaps even CONCACAF at times. The attendance numbers were pretty underwhelming. The viewership numbers were kind of exactly where we expected them to see. We didn't really see huge jumps when it comes to viewership. And that's kind of the trick with the Olympics. There's so many competitions going on. There's so many sports that are going on. There's, it's a very limited, smaller-ish competition. Where does the Olympics sit? What's the feel of the Olympics in women's football? And that's a completely different episode. But a year that was marked by the Olympics, there was a fair amount of European teams go at it. It was fun. Internationally, we saw some teams take a step forward, others take a step backwards. We saw some changes on the managerial stages. There's still a ton of vacant positions. The Canadian team, the Scottish team, the Irish team. How is that going to be filled up? It's all going to be interesting to see. Emma Hayes on the international stage to continue. Who would have thought that Laura's going to happen? Certainly not me. But it's exciting, and that's quite a memorable way to wrap up the international stage. And not to mention as well, we saw some historic attendance figures when it came to some of these other international teams. Wales, again, another one. Ireland hit some records at home, Portugal, Czech Republic. There was a lot of these minor victories. And it's all about building on top of that, keeping that momentum going to continue to hit new heights going into what should be a very, very exciting 2025 when it comes to the international stage. Let's turn things a little bit to club football. Now, again, I wish I could sit here for 2 hours and talk about everything that we saw at the club football level, but I'm just going to quickly recap some of the major leagues. So let's start a little bit with England. We saw the WSL undergo a new era of leadership under the Women's Professional Leagues Limited, the WPLL. And there was a lot of questions on that leadership. Perhaps the leadership came out and said some very odd remarks of how they wanted to grow the league, and understandably it was met with do you know what you're doing? Are we expected to see what we thought we were going to see? And we saw a minor change at the start of this season where things were shifting from the FA player to YouTube. That has not been met, I think, with the best reception because we have seen the level of broadcast. There's also been some frustration with some countries being geo-blocked when they shouldn't be geo-blocked, because if it was on the FA player, that wouldn't be the case otherwise. And so there's been frustration with that. I will give them the benefit of the doubt, though, and say there's learning opportunities and there's learning curves. However, there's only so many mistakes that you can make at this stage of the game where England is booming the way it is, right? I think fans, and I think women's football fans too, are very receptive to change and very receptive to, okay, let's try something new and see how it grows. But it's how many mistakes are we going to be seeing in a match day? And that should be limited, right? not to come from the name Leagues Limited. But the number of mistakes of a league that is booming and really has as many eyes as it's ever had before should be limited. The WPLL secured a new broadcast team. The WSL agreed to a record 65 million euros domestic 5-year TV league, which is the biggest they have ever done with Sky Sports and BBC. Doing a little bit of math, that is 7 to 8 million more per season. And it shows huge investments in the broadcast world of women's sports. The level of accessibility of English women's football is fantastic to see. For me, I think they're really setting the tutorial for other European leagues of how the game should be accessible, the way they're going out and investing this much money. I mean, over 100 million in the last few years when it comes to broadcast deals is huge. Last season, the league's overall average attendance increased by around 31%. Brilliant. Arsenal needs to be given a lot of credit for that. They had the largest average attendance in the league at 29,000, almost 30,000 if you're rounding it up. An average attendance of 30,000 is just wild to think in women's football. Now, am I like not believing it? Like, no, absolutely not. But to see where the game has grown in just a few years, it's really just so heartwarming to see, honestly. Like, yes, I had no doubt we would get to this point, and this is just one club. Like, I can't wait to see all clubs be able to hit average attendance like this. But it's just so almost like satisfying to finally see the game get here. The WSL average attendance was, if you compare it to the EPL teams, it was more than 10 English Premier League teams. That's huge. Like, that is, we really should not understate that. For a women's league to have a higher average attendance than 10 Premier League teams, like, it's just so great to see. Arsenal having the strategy of hosting as many games when it comes to the Emirates and drawing in as many numbers is huge, and it needs to be reflected and done by other teams as well. So we get to see more of these attendance records continue to be broken overall in England, and also that comes like at the back of the World Cup. At the end of the day, England were finalists at the World Cup. They had a pretty good damn tournament, and so they were riding on the momentum of being, European champions and then making the World Cup final, and then they're doing so good at just keeping that momentum from international football going into their own league that is done so brilliantly. It's executed so well. Again, like I mentioned, there's been so many mistakes, but that's expected. Like, there's a learning curve here. But these mistakes need to be limited because there's so much potential that you must capture that can't be gone anywhere. We saw Manchester United also secure their first Women's FA Cup. They beat Spurs 4-0 in the final. It was not the smoothest campaign. It certainly wasn't the smoothest season for United, but they were able to secure their first ever silverware against Spurs. That was their first ever appearance in a major final. It was kind of the first season of Robert Villahamn and the new era under him. We're seeing some obstacles hit their way this time around this season, which is also not surprising. But we continue to see how he's building his team. We're seeing a much more diverse level of recruitment in terms of youngsters, in terms of, they've got a little Australian seasoning on top of it with Hayley Raso also joining in the summer, some Nordics, some, it's a good mix, and we're seeing him put the team together. So yes, they've hit a few rough patches this season, but it was a really great first season under him last year. And I'm excited to see how we continue to see Robert Villahamn. I also have an interview with the Spurs head coach here on my channel, which I highly recommend you check out. It's very interesting and enlightening to see how a male works in the women's game and how he handles himself as a head coach of a women's team, where he originally started from the men's game. So certainly I recommend you check that out. Chelsea winning last season, where it came neck and neck between them and Manchester City. I mean, it was like, I remember the tension after the last few weeks, and Bunny Shaw getting injured and City dropping points in like 2 games before the end of the season, and it was just, and the whole cloud of Emma Hayes leaving. Like, last season had a really good sense of intensity about it, and a good sense of like, we're really seeing the WSL get to a point where we're like, it was just, I think last season was really fun, and especially the last few weeks, because I think City it was just so close. But Chelsea continued their dominance, and they continue their dominance, so it seems, under Sonia Bompasta, who took over from Emma Hayes. But overall, I think England had a great 2024. Though they're working under new leadership, I would say it's been pretty darn successful so far. Moving on to Sweden, and I keep saying this every time I talk about the Swedish league, but if you're not watching the Swedish league, you are truly missing out. It runs a little bit differently to your most typical European leagues. It ends and it concludes in November, so it's not currently going on. But if you're not watching the Swedish league, you have to get on it because it is so fun. It is so different, I think, for me, when you compare it to the WSL or the French league or even the From Bundesliga. It has its own excitement, and just the history behind it. You can really get to feel it with some of these older-ish clubs. And so if you're not watching the Swedish league, I always give it a plug. You need to get on it. If you missed it out this season, enough missing out, because you really are missing out. But over there in the Swedish league, Rosengard won the title. They went unbeaten for 23 games, a historic and a long streak that they set. They lost a single game that entire season, and it was to Hammarby. Them two teams, Rosengard and Hammarby, have been going at it kind of neck and neck in the past few seasons. Hammarby won last season, Rosengard won this season, but it is quite exciting, and who's very exciting to watch is Momoko Tenikawa, who won the Golden Boot, 16 goals. She is a phenom, and she is literally 19 years of age. Guys, she was born in 2005, smashed 16 goals in the Damosvaskan, and if you needed a reminder to feel a little old, she was literally born in 2005. But what a talent Tenikawa is. So exciting. And I think when you look at the Japanese youth system, and the Japanese team as is has really kind of surprised a fair amount of folks in the last 2 years. But when you look at the next bunch that's coming in, who's already integrated into the team, it's so exciting. So she was one of the very exciting storylines to follow. The Rosengard unbeaten streak was also really fun to follow. But for me, it was Rosengard finishing 7th the season before and going on to have a dominant season the way that they did. They started to utilize their B team when it came to training. They were very smart in how they used the transfer window. They didn't necessarily lose a lot of names, but I think when you look at the Swedish teams, they don't also have a huge... It's not deep pockets. So they utilize the window really well with the funds that they have, and they relied on kind of the tightness of that team. So the way that they changed, things with bringing in the B team when it came to training, they recruited neatly and well. They held back some of their strong players. It showed that there was changes that happened in the offseason that were reflected in them winning the league after finishing 7th. And so they got very creative with their budget. It just, for me, it was a really fun storyline to continue to watch. So if you're not watching the Swedish league, you're certainly missing out. Get watching on it because it was fun this season. It's always fun. And it's also going to be fun next season. Heading into the French league and France, I think it was a bit of a disappointing year for the French teams and the French league. It's been a bit troubling, let's face it. Bordeaux got relegated last season and is currently facing bankruptcy. Bordeaux is a team that was once in the Champions League. They were Champions League contenders. I've done a video on the rise and fall of Bordeaux that I suggest. It's a bit of a sad story, but again, it's one of those stories in women's football, and it shows bigger pains and bigger symptoms of what's happening in France, in the state of women's football in France itself. The average attendance numbers across the league have also dropped. PSG's and Lyon's have also plateaued, which is not so great. And I think also when you look at the big dogs in France, it's not a very competitive league, and we have to be honest with that. And when you look at PSG, for example, and again, the two big dogs, Lyon, have gone through a bit of a transitional period, you could say, with the ownership changes, the head coach changes. They had a rough patch with injuries that didn't help them so much in the Champions League. They lost their dominance there. And PSG, it's always been so much trouble in the locker room. And when you don't see any trouble in the locker room, it's trouble when it comes to the ownership, and it's trouble to how they're spending money, and it's trouble to kind of the drama that's happening behind the coaching staff. And so PSG really has never been able to get a stable grip, right, on what is happening. They play their games at their own training ground, and that has also been very troubling. Like, it's not a very big stadium. It's also not very accessible. Actually, there's been, a ton of coverage on how inaccessible it is for fans to travel to. And it's like, when those are the two big dogs that are supposed to drive the league, they're not doing a very successful job at it. What do you depend on, man? There's nothing to depend on. And that is the issue of the French league for me, is that it's plateaued. It's looking for solutions, but they just can't find the solutions to their problems because there are so many problems. For me, it's not only that they're not able to find solutions, it's the fact that they're not changing things, right? Like, that great saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Many of it is broke. Like, they gotta fix it. And so I don't know where the French league goes from here. Like, the FFF sucks. Let's face it. Let's put it that way. That's kind of the simplest way to do it. The federation simply sucks, and the way they've treated this league also sucks. I was really hoping to see France do really well at the Paris Olympics, because that would have been a really good push of momentum for them to capture and get on top of. But that didn't happen. That wasn't the case. And we just talked a little bit about the Olympics. It really was not the case. And so I'm hoping for a bit of a rejuvenated 2025. Maybe France does really well at the Euros. Maybe that is the momentum they've been really wanting. But when you have the big decision makers not trust in this and not want to invest in this properly and accordingly, then that's where you face a lot of issues. Last season in the Champions League, there was 3 French teams. This time around, there's only 1 French team, Paris FC and PSG both being knocked out and not making it through. That also doesn't really benefit them, where they also have a single French team there, and it's not looking very pretty for the French league, I think, when you compare it to the rest of the leagues. The Frauen Bundesliga, it has been a very fun season for the Frauen Bundesliga this season. If you're not watching it, it really is a lot of battles at the top of the table. And when you compare it to last season too, there was a lot of worries of where's the competition. Wolfsburg struggled a little bit at the start of the season. Bayern won the title very comfortably with more than 4 games to spare and play. And so what for me last season reflected is there was a bit of trouble, and I think that was fine. And it was a time of like, okay, let's look at what we need to change, because they needed to change some things. And going into the season, we did see some changes. They announced that they are expanding the league. They're expanding the league next year, and I've done a complete video on what that expansion looks like, which is going to be exciting. It's going to look a little bit different in terms of money. It's going to look a little bit different in terms of deals that they're going to. There's a few deals that are expiring when it comes to both sponsorship and a broadcast that they're going to revisit. How does that look like? More competition, more fixtures. Is the competition changing? Like, the whole purpose of this expansion of the league is to have more competition, but that's in theory. How does it look like in practice? And so I think it got a little bit of an extra bit of energy this season, which is maybe why we're seeing these battles at the top of the table. And it's looking exciting. Like, it's a little bit of an end of an era this season. This is the end of the season where we have this many teams, where we have this sort of setup. Bayern have shown the importance of academy products, which, for example, when you compare them to, let's say, Wolfsburg, they don't necessarily have that point. Frankfurt have been a little bit better in that. So academy products, it's almost like we went through an era where we forgot about academy products in Germany, and now we're being reminded of that. And I think that's also part of the whole changing of the league and the growth of the league. And so it's exciting, I think, to see this bit of change, and I very much look forward to wrapping up the season in 2025 and also the next 2025-2026 season. There's plenty that I can sit and talk about. The European football, the Champions League certainly being one of the most exciting talking points. Last season, obviously, Barcelona winning their 3rd title, defeating Lyon in the final 2-0. 6-1 matches played, 192 goals were scored, over 500,000 attendance cumulative. The average attendance reached the highest. Aitana Bonmati once again winning the Best Player award, rightfully so, because she's one hell of a player. I think it once again reiterated the change of the shield, and it's kind of Barca are the dogs to go after, but they also are currently with the new head coach. Carolina Green-Hampson, for me, had one hell of a campaign last season, both in the Champions League and in the Spanish League, once again showing that she is one of the best forwards in the game and that she must not be forgotten about. When we look at the season, we saw some new teams qualify, Galatasaray being the first Turkish teams to play in the Champions League, Hammarby making a first appearance in the Champions League. They've unfortunately exited from the group stages, but I mean, what a huge showing from them. They certainly brought some of their drama to one of their Manchester City games, but we said that we saw them and Galatasaray making it and other big teams like PSG missing out, and so there's much to talk about in the Champions League, but I talked about the expansion of the Champions League and kind of the changes that are happening of European football in my earlier video, so certainly check that out. And once again, as the season progresses, hopefully there'll be a lot of content coming onto that. But wrapping European football and quickly going across the border to the NWSL, what a season. Going into the season, the talk of the town was, holy moly, where do they have this much money from? There was huge amounts of money being spent on players. We saw big names come into the league, the Barbara Banda, the Oshawala for me, it's just, I'm not going to talk about the millions of really good players that were in the league, but that was kind of the main talk. For me, the story was Orlando Pride. If you have followed the team across the last 7 years, you have seen them build, rebuild, fail, build again, rebuild, fail once again, build, fail, build and fail and rebuild, and it's been such a journey for them. They've struggled off the field, on the field. I mean, the franchise has really gone through it, and the way they have put it together this season was honestly so heartwarming to watch. They won their first NWSL title, Marta's first NWSL title, and I mean, if you are a lover of the game, it makes me happy to think about Marta winning her first NWSL title and rethinking about some of these videos that we saw. They had a record unbeaten streak, finished at 24 matches, 18 wins, 6 draws. Another record that they hold is the league's record of unbeaten streak from the start of the season that was set of 23 games. I mean, the number of records that they set in their own fashion is remarkable. Barbara Banda, in her own way, set a club record for the most goals across all competitions, 17. It was her and Temwa Chawinga neck and neck on top. It was just such a beautiful battle between these two players, bringing in so many new eyes to this incredible African talent. I did an interview with Temwa Chawinga on my Substack that I highly recommend you check out, because her story is honestly truly inspirational. I'll leave a link in that description down below. But talking about Kansas City as well, their first ever women's only purpose stadium in the US. There was the energy behind it, the way that they hosted the final over there. Kansas had a really, really fun season, and it was really neck and neck between them and Orlando. And it's almost like we got to see a bit of a rivalry between Kansas City and Orlando, which I hope it continues to grow. And speaking of the final, it was a record championship weekend viewership of over 2.5 million viewers. It beat the MLS championship weekend. There was some new all-time ratings across all platforms, on CBS, on Amazon. I mean, it was just on Prime, everywhere. It was a record-breaking season. It continues to be record-breaking seasons across all leagues. It's exciting. Quickly giving a shout out to the Northern Super League here in Canada. It kicks off in 2025, so I am so looking forward to it, and I will have plenty of coverage building up into that league, because we need to give it so much attention. We need to be talking about it, because when we talk about investing in women's football, it also means starting new professional leagues and investing in those as well. We cannot start investing 10, 20 years down the line. We have to start investing from day one, and that is super important. And now here in Canada, we have a huge opportunity to do that. And so much happened. Much more to happen in 2025. It's going to be super exciting for me professionally here on the channel too. It has been brilliant and super fun to have so many different guests, players, former players, collaborators, journalists, fellow content creators. It has been really fun, and I've truly enjoyed every single episode that I've made, and I cannot wait to see what 2025 brings for me, for the channel, for everybody. I hope everybody's having a great holiday season. I hope everybody's writing down their New Year's resolutions. Certainly doesn't get old when we do that and look back at it at the end of the year and be like, wow, I was quite hopeful at the start of the year. But I hope everybody got to enjoy some fun at the end of the year. Happy holidays, happy new year. Let's hope 2025 brings lots of fun and good games. Not so much drama, hopefully, in women's football, but I look forward to covering it all. And as usual, to stay updated and to continue enjoying the beautiful game, make sure you subscribe to me